Alright, first off, I'd like to apologize about the graphics here. I'm not real creative when it comes to using technology to create graphs online. So if you're good at this, if you can make this look a lot better, like the one we had in class, and find a way to put it online, that'd be great. I'll provide extra credit to anybody who does that. So if you're listening to this, you got an opportunity to get some extra credit points if you can take this and make it look a lot nicer, easier to read. But basically, what we want to talk about here today is government interference in the marketplace and why that happens and the unintended consequences that happen because of it. We're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about price floors and we're going to talk about price ceiling. A price floor is enacted by the government, and what it is the legal minimum amount that a producer must pay employees. We oftentimes refer to this as minimum wage. So if you read the graph carefully here, this is your demand curve, which is labeled, and unfortunately the supply curve is not labeled. But I guess it is. It's just over here. But anyway, the demand curve here represents the demand for workers by companies and employers, and the supply curve represents the number of workers able and willing to work at a given price. And under normal circumstances, the wage here that we went through would have been P1, because that's where equilibrium meets supply and demand, and Q1 is your equilibrium quantity. Now, here's the problem. If the government comes in and says, look, this P1 is not enough, it's this wage, that's what this is right here, the y-axis is your wages. If that wage is considered to be too low by the government, they will sometimes raise or require the employers to pay their employees a certain amount. They may raise it up to P2. And that sounds like a very good thing to do, and sometimes it is. But what can happen in those types of situations is this. Since the P2 now hits our demand line here, the quantity demanded by the employer, the person who hires workers, hits that demand curve right here. They were down here, and now they're over here. So if you follow a straight line down from that, the quantity demanded by the employers for workers is at this point right here. Now, if you continue to follow that same P2 line across, that minimum wage that was enacted by the government, over here it hits the supply of workers able and willing to work at this point. And if you're able to follow a straight line down from there, the quantity supplied is over here. So because quantity supplied is larger than quantity demanded, you have a surplus of workers. You have excess supply. So therefore, you have a number of people who are able and willing to work that aren't. So we sometimes will call this unemployment. And so this is an unintended consequence of government interference in the marketplace. And so what happens in this situation is either employers will lay off workers. They'll either drop their they can't necessarily drop their wages because this is against the law, but they'll lay off employees. They'll cut back their hours. They may reduce some benefits to their workers, or if they don't want to lay anybody off or do these things, they may just raise the prices of all their goods and services so that they can make up for this loss of money that they're having to pay out. Their resource cost now is higher. So therefore, they're going to make it up by raising prices for everybody, and that can sometimes lead to inflation. So this looks like a good thing, and sometimes it is. But if workers respond by doing these things, then we have some unintended consequences that result because of it. Again, if you can make this a better graph, please let me know. Show me. I'll give you some extra credit for it. Now, the other type of government intervention is known as a price ceiling, and this is the maximum amount that a producer can charge, not change, it should say charge. So what this means is we often use this with like rent control. So here our y-axis is going to be rent, and our x-axis will be the quantity of tenants in the marketplace. And in normal circumstances, you have P1 as your price and Q1 as your quantity, and that's where they come together. So here you have your demand curve, which isn't labeled, and it should be. And I would expect you to have that in your test. But the demand curve here is the demand for housing units, maybe apartment units for renting, and the supply curve here is just the supply of units that are available. So in normal circumstances, P1's here, Q1's here, and your equilibrium point is right there. Something else that's missing that should be in there. So what the government will do sometimes, with good intention, is say, this P1 might be too high. Maybe this P1 is $1,000 per month. Well, they might say, hey, we want to make sure that people can afford to live in their house and pay for other necessities like food and clothing. So they'll say to the landlord that they can't charge that P1, that the highest amount that they can charge is this P2. So just like the previous example, if you follow this line straight across, it hits the supply curve right here. Okay, so that's the quantity supplied of housing units or apartments. But that same P2 would lead over here to the demand curve, and the quantity demanded by consumers to live in those apartment units would be much higher than the quantity supplied. So really what you have here is a shortage of housing units, because beforehand the suppliers would have been supplying a lot more than they are now. They're not getting a high enough price, so they cut back on their supply because it just doesn't make economic sense for them to stay up here. However, if they do continue to keep their housing units open, and they don't tear down some of their apartment units to save money, the problem there is that they're making less money. They're getting now only this much, whereas they were getting that much from tenants. So when something breaks in the house, or if there's a leaky roof or a broken window, there's really no incentive for them to fix it, or there's really no ability for them to fix it because they're not getting as much money. So a lot of times what happens is you have rundown places, rundown apartment units that you'll see because of this. So that's a huge unintended consequence that we have right here, and sometimes can even lead to other unintended consequences like the black market and places for people to live, which we'll talk more about in class. Now, this equilibrium, one quick thing here, when we have here a price ceiling, if the original equilibrium point were below the price ceiling, this thing would have no effect. The price ceiling would have no effect, because you would already be charging less than what the government was requiring you, or saying that you couldn't charge over. So if this original equilibrium point that you see right here was below the price ceiling, there's no effect. So what we said in class is, if the original equilibrium is above the ceiling, outside the house, on top of the house, on the roof, then there's some negative byproducts, and those things are these right over here. Same thing with price floor. If you are outside the house, if equilibrium is below the floor, then there are some unintended consequences, and those are the things that we talked about earlier. So you have to look at whether or not equilibrium is in the house or out of the house. If equilibrium is below the floor, like it is here, here's a price floor at P2. If that original equilibrium is down here, then you have unintended consequences. Whereas if it were above the price floor, you would not. So there would be no pending effect. So you just keep that in mind. Same thing down here. If equilibrium is above the ceiling, outside the house, then there are negative consequences that result because of it. But if it's underneath the ceiling, then there's no pending effect. So anyway, we'll go through this again more in class, but you'll have a couple questions on price floors and price ceilings on the test.